Computer science. We're going to talk about the for-each loop today. The for-each loop is another way you can iterate over things. In this case, we're going to use a for-each loop to iterate over each element of an array list. There's the syntax right here. So you write the word for, string element, colon, list, in parentheses, you got your curly braces, and then you do something in here. So we're printing out the value of element. Let's look more specifically at the syntax. And remember what we're doing, all the for each loop is going to do is run some code against each element in a list. And in this case, our list is this parameter that's array list called list. So the type, so you write the word for, you have some parentheses, and then you put a type. The type is whatever the type of the list you're iterating over is. You don't have to think, you just have to look. If I'm iterating over this list, what's inside the angle brackets? That's the first thing I write inside my for loop header, the type of the element in the list. The last thing you write in the header is the name of the lists. In this case, it's called list. And again, you don't have to think. If you're writing a for loop, you know what list you're iterating over, so you know what it's called. You just have to look in the code, what is this list called? That's what you write there at the end of the for loop header. This part, where you're naming the element from the list, you can call that whatever you want. That's just a variable name. So in this case, this is an array list of strings. So our for loop is for string element colon list, because the list is called list. It's a list of strings, so the type is string. And then I decided to use the variable element, but you can use whatever variable name you want. And that variable name is what you'll use inside the loop. The code inside the loop will do something with that element, and that element will be one of the elements from the list. And this will iterate over each element of the list in order. So the first iteration, this will be index 0. The next iteration will be index 1. The value stored in the variable is the value, though, not the index. So the string that's in the list, that's what element will be. Usually, when we're naming this variable, we would name it after the singular version of the list name, because usually a list is named with a pluralized version of what's in the list. So this might be an array list of words. And so words would be the end of my header here, but that element variable, I might call it word, because word is one of the elements from words. It helps you just not have to think that hard when you're writing a for loop. It's pretty straightforward. You write the word for, the type of the list, some variable that's usually the singular version of the list name, colon, the list name that you're getting out of the code. And so you don't have to think too hard. You just kind of write that out, and it's just the information you need. We're declaring a variable that's going to store a value from the list. You put a colon and you write the list you're storing the variable from. And then in here, in this case, we're just printing, but we would normally do more complicated stuff inside of this loop, depending on the problem you're trying to solve. So here's an example. Let's say the values of this list words is dragons fly together. So there's 3 elements in this list. The first one is dragons, then fly, then together. This loop will iterate over each element, and for each element, it will print that value, what I called word. So the first iteration, it prints dragons, print line dragons. Next line, it prints fly, and then next line, it prints together. So it's going to execute this code for each element in the list, one at a time, in order from left to right. So starting from the first element all the way to the last element. And that's it. That's a for each loop. You got to basically memorize the syntax, and then understand that when you have a list, you probably want to do something to each thing in the list. The for loop is what you're going to do. This is a for each loop because it iterates over each element in the list that you pass it. So there's a few things you can't do with a for each loop that's important to know. So you can't modify the list inside of the loop. So if we're iterating over each element of this list words, inside of this loop, you cannot add things to the list and you cannot remove things from the list. Your code won't, it'll compile, but it won't run. You'll get a runtime error. It won't work if you try to add or remove inside of the body of a for each loop. You cannot loop backwards. It always starts at the beginning and goes to the end and iterates over each element of the list. So you can't loop backwards and you cannot skip elements. And you cannot use a for each loop with a string. So it might make sense to use a for each loop to iterate over each element, each character of a string. It doesn't work. Java just isn't programmed to interpret a string that way. So you have to use the Frankenstein algorithm that we talked about to iterate over each element, each character of a string. For a list, you use a for each loop. And that is it. That's it. For each loops. Pretty simple. And you can use them to solve all sorts of problems. Usually, if you have a list and you're using a list in your code, you're going to have a loop to iterate over the elements somewhere. So if you see a list, it's a good red flag that you're going to need a loop in your code. And that is computer science.